Owen Bondano is an educator who focuses on growing students as empathetic, critical thinkers. I think that is so important. That's a great phrase. And communicators in a space where they feel safe and empowered. Owen teaches English at the Oak Park High School ninth grade learning community and is the 2020-2021 Michigan Teacher of the Year. Congratulations on that. On Owen's spare time, he is a writer for the Detroit Municipal Liaison for National Novel Writing Month and an active Dungeons and Dragons player. Owen, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much.
So, yeah, I have to let you know that way back in the day, I was a half chaotic dwarven fighter.
Very nice. I'm my biggest character is a gnome druid. So
okay, there you go. So thank you for joining us. Congratulations. We'll take again questions at the end so you can get into your presentation. So let's roll the dice and see where your adventure is going to take us.
Certainly. Let me start by sharing my presentation with you. There we go. As Kevin just introduced, my name is Owen Bondano. I teach ninth grade English in Oak Park, and I am the current Michigan Teacher of the Year. I'd first like to start by thanking Defeat the Label and Mimic and all of the other individuals whose hard work have led to this community conversation, which is so important. And just like J Marks, I would also like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from the traditional land of the Anishinaabe tribe here in Canada, in Windsor specifically, in this country of Canada, which was named because of a miscommunication between French colonists and the Huron-Iroquois tribe. French colonists asked the tribesmen what the land was called, and they replied with the village, which in their language, the word for village is Kanata. And this communication spun into the name for an entire country, even as those who spoke the language were disenfranchised and victimized. So I'd like to acknowledge that I benefit from this theft and violence here on stolen land. But like I said, my name is Owen Bondano. And I would like to give one more note on language before I begin. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the terms LGBTQ and queer sort of interchangeably. That's because I use the word queer as a personal identifier and as a community identifier, but I do want to acknowledge that not all LGBTQ people feel comfortable with the word queer, and you should not use the word queer to describe someone without their permission in advance. And I also wanted to give you my labels for myself. I think that in this context, it just makes sense so that there's no confusion later on when I say something that doesn't make sense. So I wanted to let you know that I identify as bisexual, meaning I'm capable of experiencing attraction to those who are of the same and of different genders than myself. And I use the label transgender. I was identified female at birth, but inside I always knew that my gender was male. And so I have taken steps in adulthood to transition so that those insides and those outs match. Okay, so those are my terms. So first, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about me, just so that what follows makes a little bit more sense. When I was 8 years old, my parents divorced and my mother came out as a lesbian. This actually didn't, people were worried that it would confuse me as an 8-year-old, but it didn't. To me, it made perfect sense. If my mom likes girls and doesn't like boys, then why would she want to stay married to my dad? That doesn't make sense. But it gave me a very early picture of LGBTQ discrimination and bullying. I was put in my school's support group for children of divorce, and none of the reasons for divorce that the teacher talked about matched what was going on in my family. And when I brought up what was going on in my family, I was pretty quickly sort of shushed. I remember the day that I defined the word lesbian to some boys on the playground in my school because they didn't know what it meant. And I got punished for talking about inappropriate subjects. I very quickly got the message that my family was not appropriate for school. My mother was angry about this, but at the same time, too afraid to do anything about it because she knew that the wrong judge could decide that just because she's a lesbian, that means she's an unfit parent, and she would have no legal recourse if that happened. So I learned quickly that the best way to take care of yourself when someone says or does something that's homophobic is to keep your head down, to sort of keep it moving and pretend like it doesn't affect you. And by high school, kids mostly weren't concerned with my mom anymore. They were more directly targeting me. I didn't know yet that I was trans. I didn't realize that till college, but I never really conformed to a lot of the standard ideas about gender. And I've always been bisexual. I've known that for as long as I can remember. and I've always been out about it. I've never hid it. I dated boys and girls in high school, and I remember the whispers in the hallway. I remember students telling me I was going to go to hell. I remember being told that I shouldn't be allowed to use the bathroom because I was a danger to those who were in the bathroom. I remember the principal denying us creating a GSA when we wanted to create one, telling us that she was denying us this to keep us safe, that being in the GSA would make us targets from our classmates, as if the kids in school didn't already know who we all were. I remember gossiping with my friends in high school about which teachers we thought might be queer. So and so in the math department only talks about his significant other with the word partner. Could that mean he's gay? What about so and so in the English department who never has any pictures of her spouse? And it seemed like casual gossip at that time, but looking back, I can see that it really was a desperate search for more adults in our lives who might be like us, who have gone through what we've gone through, who've survived it, and who managed to have successful lives. We needed what the actress and activist Laverne Cox calls possibility models. Like her, I don't really like the term role model. I don't think that anyone should model their life after mine, or anyone's for that matter. But I prefer to present myself as one possible model of what adulthood might look like. I show my students one version of what's possible. And that's why it's so important to me now to be out and visible in my classroom and beyond it. I'm trying to be the teacher that I needed when I was in high school. So that's a little background for you. To start with, I wanted to give us some numbers. These are from GLSEN, from their 2019 National School Climate Survey. So these are all relatively recent numbers. And this is not nearly all the data that survey produced, but it's some of the ones I wanted to draw our attention to. We can see here that 96% of LGBTQ students were harassed or assaulted at school. Again, we're talking specifically about in recent years. And 84% of trans students felt unsafe at school because of their gender. These numbers may seem quite high. As someone who was an LGBTQ youth, they don't surprise me at all. We know that anti-LGBTQ discrimination means more missed school, lower GPAs, and lower self-esteem. If we combine that with some numbers we have from the CDC, we know that LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in homeless youth. We know that they are 4 times more likely to try heroin or meth. We know that they're 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And there's nothing about being LGBTQ that is inherently linked to drug use or to suicidal tendencies or anything like that. We know that these behaviors come from the lack of support, from feeling like nobody accepts you or loves you for who you are, for not being able to see a path to a successful future, for dealing with harassment and bullying on a regular basis. Those lead to those behaviors, those self-medicating and coping behaviors. But there is hope. 20 years of research has shown a decrease in this victimization. And we know that supporting students is a big factor in that decrease. So I wanted to talk a little bit. The survey comes out with 4 sort of pillars of what LGBTQ students need to feel safer and more supported. Again, as a prior LGBTQ youth, none of these things surprised me when I saw them in the survey, but I wanted to sort of base the rest of our talk here on these 4 pillars. So according to the survey from GLSEN, students need comprehensive anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies. They need gender and sexuality alliances. They need an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, and they need teachers and school staff who are supportive of their LGBTQ students. Again, none of this surprises me as a queer person, but I wanted to sort of delve into what each of these can look like in our own practices and in our own classrooms. So the first one is comprehensive anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies. Let me take a moment here to state I've got a lot of resources in this presentation, and they're all directly linked. So these boxes here go directly to the resource I'm talking about. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you the link to get to this presentation so you can access all of these resources for yourself from within the presentation. But these policies that we're talking about here, first of all, you should know your district's anti-bullying policy. Every district is required to have one by law, and you should know it just as well as you know the dress code and how to submit your grades and the policies for your evaluation. You should know your anti-bullying policy just as well. It's your tool for repairing harm and taking care of your students. Our job is to be advocates. And sometimes that means helping a student report bullying, and more importantly, staying with them by their side in everything that follows after reporting. If your district's anti-bullying policy isn't adequate, in your opinion, the State Board of Education has a pretty good model policy that can be adopted wholesale by any district. It includes gender identity and sexual orientation as protected classes within that. It's linked here, like I said. And additionally, bullying based on someone's known or perceived LGBTQ identity falls under the larger category of bias bullying. Bias bullying is when an incident is rooted in some kind of discrimination. It may require a different approach from other forms of bullying, and bias bullying has been an issue that disproportionately affects our minority students. And so MOASH, that's Michigan's Organization of Adolescent Sexual Health, has a really great comprehensive guide for how to deal with bias incidences. Say that 10 times fast. It focuses on supporting the students, their safety and their comfort, and ultimately building community. And it includes steps you can take before, during, and after the incident, including processing and healing together after they've happened. So it's a really good place to look if you're looking for tools when these incidents occur. The second pillar is gender and sexuality alliances. Now, back in the day, GSA stood for Gay Straight Alliance, but most places are now switching over to this new terminology of Gender and Sexuality Alliance. It's a little bit more inclusive. Where I teach, my students have elected to call our organization the QSA, or Queer Straight Alliance. But whatever the group is called, there is empirical evidence that the presence of a GSA on campus really helps to empower our LGBTQ students. And it empowers them just as much as having policies in place that protect them. What's more, the presence of the GSA is beneficial to more than just the LGBTQ students. It's more than just the members benefit from having it. It changes the culture of an entire school. Even students who aren't members receive this message of inclusion. They're more willing to publicly support their LGBTQ peers, and they're just generally more accepting of diversity because of the influence of the GSA. If you're the kind who likes research, or if you need that research to convince community members that this is necessary, again, I've linked here some peer-reviewed research on the benefits of having a GSA to your building. And then if you're getting started building one, the GSA network is a really excellent resource. And I've linked here to their general guide for building a GSA and a more recent guide to how to have a virtual GSA, which for those of us who are continuing our programs in the pandemic is super invaluable. The third pillar is an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. Now, when I was in college, I'll tell you a little story here. When I was in college, I was studying a lot of the same authors that I had studied in high school. You know, these were the authors of the canon. And as somebody who was getting ready to teach English, I had to be very familiar with them. And I remember I was sitting in class, we were discussing Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which, first of all, is a poem that I adore. How could I not adore a poem that tells you resist much, obey little? A poem that celebrates the self as this radical notion of being a change and of connecting to all of humanity and all of the planet. I mean, just the line, I too am not attamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yap over the roofs of the world. Great. But anyway, we were talking about this poem, and the professor casually mentioned that there was a sequence in it that reflects Whitman's love and loss of his male lover. I pretty much fell out of my chair. I mean, how much of my honors 11th grade English had been spent studying Whitman and the Transcendentalists, and no one had ever bothered to even mention that he was queer. It felt like I had been lied to, and like it was a secret that had been deliberately kept from me. Like all of the people in my high school had wanted me to feel disconnected and isolated. They had wanted me to be separated from that wider community of queer people and from our collective history. And this happened over and over again post high school for me. A professor would mention something, or in my own reading and research, I would discover something, and suddenly I had found another piece of queer history. It felt like this link that I shared with a past was getting stronger than I had ever experienced it before. And I realized really and truly that we have always been here, that we've contributed to the human experience, and being queer is not a new development for humanity, even though some of the terms we use are. But our history doesn't begin in 1969 with the Stonewall Rebellion. It's always been here. And we can create this deliberate sense of history for our queer students. Our queer students, they need to see themselves represented in the classroom, just like all students need to see themselves represented in the classroom. Of course, to paraphrase Rudine Sims Bishop, this is the concept of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And all students need that, no matter what it is that makes them different from the students around them. This can be something big. You could have a unit on queer history, you could teach a whole class on queer theory, but it doesn't have to be something big like that. It can happen every day in these small acts in our classrooms. It can be casually mentioning that a figure you're discussing in class is queer. Walt Whitman, Oscar Wilde, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, my math and science people, you can mention Alan Turing, Sally Ride, Florence Nightingale. There's so many. My gym teachers, make sure you talk about Billie Jean Kim and Michael Sam. Your students should know who these pioneering gay pro athletes were. When you're teaching the American civil rights, make sure to mention that Bayard Rustin, the right-hand man of MLK Jr., was a Black gay man, and that Stonewall was led by transgender women who were people of color. Even art teachers, why not talk about Gilbert Baker, the person who created the modern rainbow pride flag, which is a brilliant use of symbolism and metaphor and is ultimately a piece of protest art. These are just a couple of examples sort of off the top of my head, but there are more resources here for you to delve into. Again, I've given you some research if you need to prove to others why this is important for them to include. And I have given the GLSEN's guide, the GLSEN's guide to developing LGBTQ inclusive classroom resources. It's full of a lot of ways that you can make that inclusiveness sort of seamless to what you already do. And again, the key word here is to normalize. We're normalizing the experience of being LGBTQ, which sort of ties very nicely into our last pillar, which, oops, I clicked on my link on accident instead of flipping the slide. My apologies. The last pillar, which is teachers and school staff who are supportive of LGBTQ students. We've got here one of my favorite proverbs, which is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think that of all four of these pillars, this is really the most important one when it comes to supporting our LGBTQ students. I think it's the single best way that a classroom teacher can support and address these issues. So again, a couple of resources, that school climate survey that GLSEN does nationally. There is a local version with a toolkit that you can use to administer it in your own building. And I think if you do that, you will find yourself learning a lot about your building that you didn't already know. I've also linked you to the best practices for serving LGBTQ students from teaching tolerance. This is an incredible document. It really goes into a lot of detail about how we create these safe and inclusive spaces. When I do safe spaces trainings in buildings, I use this document extensively. So I wanted you to have access to that. And I've got a little infographic here of some more information from GLSEN, because the most common questions that I get about this topic really center around two things. They center around how we protect these students when there have been incidences of bullying or hate speech, and then how do we prevent these incidences from happening in the first place. So as far as reacting when something happens in your classroom, I really like this 5-step approach that GLSEN has. So the first step they have is address it immediately. So stop the behavior in the moment. Even if you're tempted to go back around to it later and you think I'll have that conversation with that student a little bit later, the rest of your class is watching and they're seeing in action. This makes your queer students wonder how safe you really are. The second thing you want to do after you've stopped to address it immediately is just name the behavior. This is as simple as describing what did you see or hear, and just put a name to it. For example, that's a derogatory word and we don't use those in my classroom. Or I'm not sure if you realized, but that comment is actually sexist and we don't discriminate in my classroom. Once you've named it, then you can, number 3, make it a teachable moment. This could be done at the time or later, because now that you've stopped and named the behavior, you've created that sense of safety and that sense that this is something you're going to interrupt. And so if you need to come back later for the rest of these steps, that's okay, because you've already taken action in the moment. So this could be done in the moment or later. It could be done whole group. It could be done just with those affected. Your classroom, your students, and every situation is going to be a little bit different. But have a conversation about what happened with the appropriate parties so that everyone knows what's unacceptable and why, and they can learn from what happened. And after that, make sure you're supporting the targeted student. Don't assume that you know how they feel or what they need. Ask them, listen to their answer. And then again, even if it's not right in that very moment, do your best to provide what it is that they need from you. And the last step is to hold students accountable. I think sometimes we can think that by going through steps 1 through 4, we've dealt with it, it's over now. But it's really important that consequences are consistent and any bullying policies that your building or district has are followed. So we have to remain fair to all of our students, right? So for that reason, follow through with any policies and consequences that are set forth by your school or district. As for the other pillar of questions I get, the whole preventing this before it happens thing, that comes down to a couple of things. We want to build our community, of course. We already know how important it is that students feel safe in the classroom. That's something that all teachers know and care about doing, I think. But it's extra important for your LGBTQ students. Build trust with them by going through this 5-step process whenever there's an incident, so they know that you're someone who will always stand up for them. Normalize being LGBTQ, like I said. This could mean incorporating books with diverse characters or families. It could mean, like I mentioned before, including queerness in your lessons. But make sure every student in your class knows that being LGBTQ is just a normal part of the human experience. The first year that I was out to my students, I had a remarkable day where I had a student at the end of class. She was packing up her belongings very slowly after the bell rang, doing that thing where she was looking around at all the other students packing up to leave, sort of waiting for them to go. And I knew she was going to approach me once we were alone, and she did. And she said to me, "I can't believe you just said you were bisexual." And I said to her, "Well, I am bisexual." And she said, "Yeah, but you just said it like it's normal." And I said, "Yeah, it is normal." And she was kind of getting worked up. And she said, "Yeah, but you said it like you're not ashamed." And I told her, "I'm not ashamed." And she sat with that thought for a moment. And then she said, "I guess I still feel a little ashamed." Um, and it was a moment with her that she got to break open a part of herself that she had been hiding and been struggling with. And I got to watch her for the rest of the school year as she bloomed into this confident young woman who knew who she was in this world. Um, so the idea that it's normal and that it's not something you need to be ashamed of is so, so important to our LGBTQ students. And one of the most effective ways, I think, to combat LGBTQ bullying is just by decentering gendering in our classrooms. This could be gendered language. Don't assume that every student who has two parents has a mom and a dad. Use language like parents, guardians, families. I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard a teacher say something unknowingly that that perpetuates these gender ideas. I hear a teacher say something like, "Can I borrow a couple of strong boys to help me move some tables?" Why is it got to be boys? And even in the way we address students every day, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, these are gendered terms that reinforce the idea of a binary. So I recommend you replace them with words like, "I call my students friends," or "scholars," or sometimes when it's less formal, "y'all." But finding ways to degender our language is really important. Most LGBTQ discrimination and bullying really comes from a place of gender roles. And, for example, when a man is walking down the street, he's by himself, and someone drives by, rolls down their window and shouts the F slur, they're not doing it because they have proof that that guy is gay. They're doing it because there's some expectation of traditional masculinity that he's not fulfilling. And the queer people who are the most ostracized are those that fall outside of gender norms, feminine men, masculine women, and those of us who are trans. It's why those of us who are trans are really lagging behind on acceptance in comparison to the rest of the queer community. We really challenge these deeply entrenched ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman. So whenever possible, don't separate your students by gender. Don't have them line up by gender or play games where you separate them by gender for an easy grouping solution. Challenge ideas that there are boys and girls clothing and toys and games and activities and interests. Use that 5-step method that's here. When someone in your classroom upholds a gender stereotype, when a young man laughs at the idea of a man crying, interrogate that idea with your students. Interrogating gender-based views helps us deconstruct that base that homophobia and transphobia and queer antagonism are built on top of. It helps us destabilize the house of cards from the bottom, rather than trying to pluck the cards off at the top. So in summary, the 4 factors that lead to a safe, affirming school culture for our LGBTQ students are anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies, gender and sexuality alliances, inclusive curriculum, and supportive teachers and staff. All 4 of these really do work together in a way that I think is not replaceable without some of the other ones. It's weaker when it's only 3. The GSA may influence the policies and other teachers being supportive and the use of curriculum. All 4 of these pillars play off of each other and interlock in a way that is really important. So when you're building these spaces, I think it's important to make sure that you have all 4 or as many of these 4 pillars in place as you can. Now, I know I've talked for a long time, so I'm going to see now, do we have any questions that have come up in this?
We do, Owen, and I think one of the great things, the climate survey, I am wholeheartedly supportive of climate surveys, and if your school hasn't done one, you listeners, urge them to do the climate survey for your school. You
Yes.
will find things out that you never thought about, or you think you knew, but you were just didn't want to address them.
Yep.
So, and I think that thing about addressing things as they happen for LGBTQ students and all students. Years ago, I sat on a plane with a teacher who told me she addresses it right away and kind of sets that tone for her room. So those are key points. And Owen, thank you for bringing those back up. I do have two questions for you that were in the chat. I'm going to go back to, so Sue is asking, wants to know, she's in Wisconsin, being in a classroom where a student rationalizes bullying of an LGBTQ youth by citing religion. So as a teacher, and I have another question. So how do you handle this particular one? I have another question for you.
Sure. So religion is definitely something that's come up in my own classroom and in my own practices. And I usually just remind those students that they are free to follow the tenets of their religion, but they are not free to judge others by the tenets of their religion. I don't usually get into, I avoid any argument about religion itself because I feel those are largely unproductive. But I think if the student is willing to listen and have a conversation one-on-one with you, first of all, don't try to have these conversations in front of the class. You can address something in the moment and say, that's inappropriate for this class, and we can talk more about that later. But I think that generally when you would try to address those things whole group, when those are the reasons, that's going to make the student dig their heels in a little bit. But if you're talking one-on-one and that student is receptive, I will usually bring up things like those statistics I mentioned earlier: 4 times more likely to commit suicide, 4 times more likely to turn to drugs, disproportionately represented in homeless youth. And I want to have a frank conversation. And, I teach secondary, so I have young adults in my room. And I have conversations with them about how that's not okay for anybody. We don't want anybody to feel like they need to turn to those places, or feel like they're not loved and accepted. And so regardless of what your personal belief may be, it's our job to support our peers and the people that we care about in our lives. And so I sometimes get some traction with the idea that you don't need to accept the person or condone their behavior or whatever, but we need to support them so that they know that they are supported and valuable as a human being.
And on that is
okay.
What about having to deal with material? So there may be some anti-LGBTQ material, or the material's fine, but how do you deal, like, it's an author who kind of comes under fire? I mean, we see a lot of that, in today's world. What we thought was great, but now we learned things which you brought up at the beginning of your talk with different artists and people who have been in popular culture. Is that something that, again, you're having that conversation with them, and just opening the door for themselves to also find answers?
Yeah, I think conversation is key. And J. Mark touched on this earlier too, about just posing questions and allowing your students to have those conversations naturally. I think that's key here as well. Not to beat around the bush, but you're talking about J.K. Rowling and how her comments here on the Twitter sphere and so on have been actively harmful to trans people. And so I had a conversation with my students about it, about the fact that it's okay for us to still enjoy the work that she has put into the world and find meaning in it in ways that are meaningful to us, but that we can't separate that from the things that she said and done. And I asked my students, how are they feeling about it? And their solutions were things like, buy her books used so that she doesn't get any money from you. Don't follow her on Twitter so she doesn't have an audience, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So they're perfectly capable of having those conversations and coming to those conclusions on their own. As always, just like anything in your classroom, you're there to facilitate a conversation for learning. And I think that we get hesitant because we don't think of these kinds of conversations as being school topics, but really we're just facilitating conversation like any other topic for our students to draw their own conclusions from.
Yeah. And just on the heels of that, and you touched on it in your own personal story, we have someone in Grand Rapids who's asking, Michelle, what's the proper way to encourage students to support a student who is currently transitioning?
So always use that student's correct name and pronouns. But when you do slip up, because it will happen, even as a trans person, I've slipped up on people's pronouns and names when they're transitioning. Model what you do in response to those situations. You know, if you accidentally say a dead name or the incorrect pronoun, just say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I mean," and then say the correct word, and then just keep it moving. You know, don't make it a big deal, but make sure that your students see you correcting yourself so that they also learn how to correct themselves when they make that mistake. Don't treat them any differently from how you would treat any other student. Look into the policies that your school already has so you can make sure that you're aligning yourself with them. And if your school doesn't have policies in place already, like many don't, the state of Michigan has some great example policies, and many other states do as well, of guidelines that you can use for things like bathroom policies and locker rooms and stuff like that. But really the biggest thing is just modeling for your students that this person is still the same classmate that you had before and that deserves the same respect as anybody else in the room. And when you slip up, you apologize, you correct yourself, and you move on. But that other than that, being trans is normal. When I came out at school, I started off in the closet at my current job because, you know, you could be fired. No longer the case as of this summer, but at the time, you could be fired from a job for being LGBTQ. And so when I decided that I needed to come out, that in order to be that teacher I needed when I was in high school, like I said earlier, I had to come out. I had a lot of conversations with my admin, and we decided that one of the first steps was me coming out in a meeting to my coworkers and really discussing what terminology I used for myself and what that meant, because I could see some very well-meaning colleagues. You know, if a student comes up to them and says, "I heard Mr. Bondano is trans," I could envision them thinking they needed to defend me from this accusation. And there are all kinds of layers there. You know, it's not an accusation. There's nothing wrong with being trans, but we see it as something that we would need to defend someone from as a society. So this idea that it's normal, speak with the student too, make sure that you know what they are comfortable with you talking about as far as their identity and story is concerned. You know, they may have certain terms they don't want you to use for them. They may want some things kept private. And you don't want to overshare with people without their permission. But once you know and are on comfortable ground, then just treat it as the totally normal thing that it is.
And would the same really apply to younger children, early elementary kids who are starting this? You have to have that conversation and be forthright with the parents as well to really understand, you know, their home dynamics and what's happening there, to kind of collectively move forward as a team for the well-being of the student.
Yeah, I firmly believe that there is no such thing as a child too young to talk about LGBTQ issues. And anybody who says otherwise, I would argue that you talk about heterosexuality every time you open up a children's book where there's a mom and a dad. And being queer can be just the same. Having a book where there's two moms or two dads, or where there's a trans parent, you know, talking about these things in the context, obviously that's age appropriate, but there is an age appropriate way to discuss it, no matter the age of the child.
Yeah, this has been great. It's great information. I have a couple of people asking about the climate surveys and how do I get it done.
So on my screen here, you can
in
see
here.
the link.
Yep.
I'll also put it in the chat like J Marks did, and I'm sure that it'll be shared out with all the other resources. But if you go to bit.ly/LGBTQ Bondano, so LGBTQ and then my last name, Bondano, all lowercase, that will take you directly to this slideshow. And all of those resources that we mentioned are linked on the slides themselves. You can just click on the name of it and it'll take you directly to that resource.
Yeah, thank you. And the only thing I can add is someone asked, how do we get this done? How do we do a climate survey? You know, you need to kind of go to your administration, and if not, you need to go to your PTA or PTO. You know, they need to be on board as well. And just keep asking for it, because it makes such a difference in your school. And the thing also, even with that, is setting up anonymous reporting, you know, stations in the school. I know schools are kind of fearful, but you can get so much great information because those students are the ones living this every single day. And we have to listen to them so we can change our bad habits. So Owen, thank you so much. And thank you and congratulations on being our teacher of the year. I can understand why. Great role model. So I thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.